Was Cain forced to marry his own sister? And why does the Bible seem to deliberately avoid explaining this troubling detail? The story unfolds with deceptive simplicity in the early chapters of Genesis. After Adam and Eve are expelled from Eden, they begin having children. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, "I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord." And again, she bore his brother Abel. The narrative moves forward with the brothers' occupations. Cain becomes a worker of the ground, while Abel is a keeper of sheep. Their story takes its tragic turn when both bring offerings to the Lord. Abel's is accepted, Cain's rejected. Consumed by jealousy, Cain murders his brother, becoming humanity's first killer. God confronts Cain about his crime and, as punishment, declares, "Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Cain laments his punishment, fearing that whoever finds me will kill me, an intriguing statement that already suggests other people exist beyond the nuclear family Genesis has introduced. The Lord places a mark on Cain, promising sevenfold vengeance on anyone who harms him. Then comes the curious transition. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. This passage contains one of the Bible's most glaring narrative gaps. In just a few verses, we've moved from a world containing only Adam, Eve, and Cain, with Abel now dead, to one where Cain has a wife, is building a city for whom, and apparently has neighbors who might kill him. The identity of this wife, this unnamed, unexplained woman who becomes the mother of Cain's lineage, is never addressed. She materializes in the text without introduction, origin story, or even a name, existing solely to continue the human bloodline through the branch of mankind's first murderer. What makes this omission particularly striking is the Bible's usual attention to genealogical detail. Throughout Genesis, we encounter meticulous family records, carefully tracing bloodlines across generations. Names matter in this text. Origins matter. Yet with Cain's wife, we find conspicuous silence. Some readers might dismiss this as a minor oversight, but biblical authors were deliberate in their construction of these foundational narratives. The text's failure to identify this woman stands out precisely because it deviates from the pattern established elsewhere in Genesis. When we encounter other marriages in early Genesis, Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, we receive clear introductions to both parties. Cain's mysterious spouse represents a deliberate narrative gap, a textual silence that practically invites questioning. This silence becomes even more perplexing when we consider what comes next in Genesis 4. After briefly mentioning Cain's descendants through several generations, the text returns to Adam and Eve. "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and called his name Seth, for she said, 'God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him.'" The narrative then follows Seth's lineage, which eventually leads to Noah. This structuring creates a clear division. Humanity proceeds through two primary branches, the line of Cain and the line of Seth. But if Adam and Eve were the first humans and Seth was born after Cain's exile and marriage, the unavoidable implication is that Cain's wife must have been his sister, or perhaps a niece, a daughter of an unmentioned sister or brother. Genesis 5 verse 4 notes that after Seth's birth, Adam had other sons and daughters, but the chronology remains ambiguous. Were these other children born before Cain's exile? The text doesn't specify. Some scholars point to Genesis 4 verse 14, where Cain expresses fear that whoever finds me will kill me, as evidence that other people existed. If only his immediate family remained, why would he fear random killers? This has led to theories about pre-Adamite humans or simultaneous creation of multiple human groups not documented in Genesis. However, these interpretations stretch beyond what the text explicitly states. The most straightforward reading suggests that Cain married a sister or close relative, yet the text deliberately avoids stating this directly. This omission creates what biblical scholars call a narrative gap, a deliberate silence that invites readers to grapple with uncomfortable implications. It's as though the ancient authors knew this detail would raise troubling questions, but couldn't avoid the logical problem inherent in a story about humanity's first generations. This textual silence speaks volumes. It suggests the biblical authors recognized the moral and logical tensions in their narrative, but chose to leave this particular question unanswered. Perhaps they understood that explicitly describing sibling marriage would create theological problems for later readers, especially after Mosaic law explicitly forbade such unions. By leaving Cain's wife unnamed and unexplained, the text maintains narrative continuity while avoiding direct confrontation with what would later become a prohibited practice. This mysterious woman stands at a critical juncture in the biblical narrative, the moment when humanity expands beyond Eden's fallen first family. Her anonymity forces us to question what other details Genesis might be leaving unspoken, what other assumptions we bring to these ancient texts without realizing it. Far from being a minor character, Cain's wife represents one of Scripture's most profound enigmas, a blank space that continues to challenge and perplex readers after thousands of years. The question of Cain's wife has troubled theologians, apologists, and biblical scholars for centuries, forcing them to develop various explanations that attempt to resolve this theological conundrum. The implications stretch beyond mere genealogical curiosity. They touch on fundamental questions about biblical interpretation, the nature of early humanity, and how we reconcile ancient texts with modern ethical frameworks. The most straightforward explanation, though uncomfortable for many believers, is that Cain married his sister or another close female relative. Early Jewish commentaries in the Midrash suggest that Cain and Abel were born with twin sisters, and Cain married his twin. According to this tradition, competition over these women was part of what fueled the brothers' fatal conflict. Rabbi David Kimi, 1160 to 1235, wrote that each son of Adam was born with a twin sister whom he would later marry, allowing for human propagation in those earliest generations. Augustine of Hippo, one of Christianity's most influential theologians, directly addressed this issue in his work, The City of God. He acknowledged the necessity of sibling marriages in humanity's first generations, as, therefore, the human race, subsequently to the first marriage of the man who was made of dust and his wife who was made out of his side, required the union of males and females in order that it might multiply, and as there were no human beings except those who had been born of these two, men took their sisters for wives, an act which was as certainly dictated by necessity in these ancient days as afterward. It was condemned by the prohibitions of religion. Many contemporary Christian apologists follow Augustine's reasoning, arguing that close relative marriages would have been necessary and genetically safe in humanity's earliest generations. They suggest that the human genome was still relatively free from harmful mutations in those first generations, making close relative reproduction less problematic than it would later become. This genetic deterioration explanation posits that as harmful mutations accumulated over generations, laws against incest became necessary to prevent birth defects and genetic disorders. The Answers in Genesis Ministry, a prominent young Earth creationist organization, defends this position by noting that Mosaic laws against incest weren't established until much later, Leviticus 18-20, suggesting that such prohibitions weren't applicable to early humanity. They argue that Adam and Eve would have been created with perfect genetics, and mutations would have accumulated slowly over generations, eventually necessitating laws against close relative marriages. Other theological traditions have sought alternative explanations. Some propose that God created other humans not mentioned in Genesis. This pre-Adamite or co-Adamite theory suggests that while Adam and Eve were the first humans in the biblical narrative's theological focus, they weren't necessarily the only humans God created. These interpretations often cite Genesis 4 verses 14-16, where Cain fears being killed by others and establishes a city, actions that seem to imply a larger human population. The Islamic tradition offers its own perspective through the Quran and Hadith literature. While maintaining that Adam and Eve were humanity's first parents, some Islamic scholars suggest that each pregnancy of Eve resulted in twins, one male and one female, and these pairs were married to each other, with the exception that no twin could marry their own twin sibling. According to this tradition, Cain, Abel, was paired with Abel's, Habil's, twin sister, but he wanted to marry his own twin instead, leading to the conflict between the brothers. More liberal theological approaches suggest reading Genesis as theological narrative rather than literal history. From this perspective, the story of Cain and Abel functions as an ideological tale explaining the ancient conflict between agricultural and pastoral societies, with the question of Cain's wife being irrelevant to the story's primary purpose. Biblical scholar John Walton argues that Genesis was written to explain functional origins rather than material origins, making questions about physical descent secondary to the text's theological messaging. Some Christian denominations have developed more elaborate explanations. Seventh-day Adventist writer Ellen G. White described antediluvian humans as a race of giants with perfect symmetry and more than twice the height of men now living, suggesting that these early humans were fundamentally different from modern humanity. Mormon theology proposes that other spirit children of God were sent to earth to receive physical bodies, potentially explaining the existence of Cain's wife and others outside Adam's immediate family. Each of these theological approaches reflects not just different interpretations of the text, but different assumptions about biblical authority, the relationship between science and faith, and how ancient texts should be read in modern contexts. The question of Cain's wife becomes a litmus test for broader theological frameworks, revealing how religious traditions balance textual fidelity with logical consistency and contemporary ethical standards. What's particularly fascinating is how this seemingly minor narrative gap has generated such extensive theological speculation over millennia. The unnamed, unexplained wife of history's first murderer has become a focal point for discussions about biblical inerrancy, the relationship between biological and spiritual understandings of human origins, and how we reconcile ancient practices with contemporary moral standards. Her very absence from the text creates a theological space that generations of believers have filled with their own understanding of how God's plan for humanity must have unfolded. To fully grasp the mystery of Cain's wife, we must leave behind our modern perspectives and immerse ourselves in the ancient Near Eastern world where Genesis originated. This historical context illuminates not just who Cain's wife might have been, but why her identity was treated as unremarkable by the biblical authors. Marriage in the ancient Near East functioned very differently from our contemporary understanding. Rather than being primarily about romantic love between individuals, marriage served as a fundamental social institution that created alliances between families, preserved property rights, ensured legitimate heirs, and maintained social order. Marriage practices that seem foreign or even disturbing to modern readers were commonplace and accepted in these ancient societies. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Canaan reveals that close-kin marriages were not only permitted but sometimes preferred in many ancient cultures. Egyptian pharaohs routinely married their sisters to preserve the royal bloodline, with Cleopatra VII herself being part of a dynasty where brother-sister marriages were standard practice for maintaining political power. While this was an extreme example limited to royalty, marriage between cousins and other relatives was common throughout the region among all social classes. Cuneiform tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, particularly from the Old Babylonian period, approximately 2000 to 1600 BCE, contain numerous marriage contracts and legal codes addressing familial relationships. The Code of Hammurabi, which predates the writing of Genesis, contains specific provisions regarding marriage between relatives, indicating these practices were common enough to require legal regulation. These historical records suggest that the taboo against close relative marriage developed gradually across different cultures rather than being universal from humanity's beginning. The Hittite laws, another ancient Near Eastern legal code, specifically prohibited certain forms of incest but allowed others. Sexual relations between a man and his mother, daughter, or son were forbidden, but relationships with certain other relatives received less severe punishments or no punishment at all. This nuanced approach to kinship and sexual boundaries suggests ancient cultures recognized some form of incest taboo, but defined its boundaries differently than we do today. Within this historical context, the biblical author's silence about Cain's wife becomes more understandable. To an ancient audience, The question of where Cain found a wife would not have seemed problematic in the way it does to modern readers. The ancient Near Eastern mind was comfortable with a world where close-kin marriages were part of the social fabric, especially in extraordinary circumstances like humanity's earliest generations. Genesis itself provides evidence that close-kin marriages were accepted within the patriarchal narratives. Abraham married his half-sister Sarah, explaining to Abimelech in Genesis 20 verse 12, "Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife." Isaac married his first cousin once removed, Rebekah. Jacob married his first cousins, Leah and Rachel. These marriages occurred long after humanity had expanded significantly, yet they were presented without moral criticism in the text. Only later, in Leviticus 18-20, were explicit prohibitions against various forms of incest codified in Israelite law. This historical development suggests an evolving understanding of appropriate marriage boundaries rather than static rules from creation onward. The absence of these prohibitions in Genesis reflects the text's historical setting and its author's cultural assumptions. Anthropological research offers another layer of insight. Claude Levi-Strauss and other anthropologists have identified the incest taboo as a near-universal cultural feature that developed independently across human societies. However, the specific boundaries of this taboo vary widely across cultures and time periods. Most societies prohibit parent-child and brother-sister unions, but beyond these core restrictions, acceptable marriage patterns show remarkable diversity. Some cultures even institutionalized cousin marriages as preferred unions. The gradual development of the incest taboo likely reflects both intuitive biological aversions, the Westermarck effect, where people develop a desensitized sexual attraction to those with whom they live closely during childhood, and social recognition of the genetic risks of close inbreeding. However, these biological factors would have been understood very differently in ancient times, without modern genetic knowledge. From a narrative perspective, the Genesis account focuses primarily on establishing theological truths rather than addressing practical questions about population genetics. The text emphasizes humanity's relationship with God, the consequences of sin, and the establishment of covenant lineages. Details that modern readers find problematic, like where Cain found a wife, were simply not central concerns for the ancient authors. Some scholars suggest that Genesis presents a representative beginning rather than a comprehensive account of all early humans. In this view, Adam and Eve represent the beginning of covenant humanity, or perhaps a particular line of humans with whom God established a special relationship, rather than being literally the only two humans initially created. This interpretation points to textual clues like the presence of other people in the land of Nod, where Cain settled. The documentary hypothesis, which suggests Genesis was compiled from multiple earlier sources, offers another perspective. Different textual traditions may have been harmonized without resolving all their logical tensions, including the question of early human population growth. The final redactors may have recognized these tensions but prioritized preserving the theological message over creating perfect narrative coherence. What remains clear is that the biblical text emerged from a specific historical context with its own assumptions about marriage, kinship, and human origins. The mystery of Cain's wife reminds us that we cannot approach ancient texts with modern expectations of comprehensive explanation or contemporary ethical standards. Instead, we must recognize how cultural context shapes both the telling of stories and the questions we ask about them. For ancient audiences, the silence about Cain's wife wasn't a troubling omission but simply a reflection of their comfort with narrative ambiguity and their different set of concerns when engaging with origin stories. The text spoke powerfully to their questions about God's nature, human sin, divine punishment, and the establishment of civilization, questions that remain relevant despite our changed understanding of human genetics and marriage practices.